The screams that pierced the Charleston night on March 15, 1847, weren't coming from the slave quarters. They were rising from the master bedroom of the Whitmore plantation house, where 17-year-old Judith pressed her back against the heavy oak door, listening to her owner burn alive in his own bed. This is the story of how a teenage girl turned the tools of oppression into instruments of liberation, and why Charleston's elite buried her name so deep that historians still struggle to unearth the truth. The scent of magnolia blossoms couldn't mask the stench of charred flesh that morning. Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds from the live oaks surrounding the Whitmore estate, their branches creaking in a wind that carried whispers through the slave quarters. The texture of fear was everywhere, in the trembling hands that served breakfast, in the stuttered responses to overseer questions, in the way even the dogs seemed to walk with their heads lowered. Judith had been property for 17 years. Born into bondage on the rice plantation 20 miles south of Charleston, she'd been sold to Marcus Whitmore at age 14 for $800, a price that reflected both her youth and her reputation for quiet intelligence. What the bill of sale couldn't capture was the steel that had been forging in her spine with every lash, every forced smile, every night she'd learned to disappear behind her own eyes. The Whitmore house stood as a testament to wealth built on human suffering. 3 stories of pristine white columns and wraparound porches, filled with furniture crafted by enslaved hands and maintained by people who would never own so much as the clothes on their backs. Judith worked inside the main house, cleaning, cooking, serving at dinner parties where Charleston's most prominent families discussed their human property like livestock at market. But something had shifted in the winter of 1846. Judith had been caught reading, not just looking at pictures or pretending to understand words, actually reading, sounding out syllables from a newspaper left on Marcus Whitmore's desk. The punishment had been swift and severe, 20 lashes, and a promise that next time would bring worse consequences. What Whitmore didn't understand was that knowledge, once gained, becomes impossible to destroy. Judith continued reading in secret scraps of newspaper, discarded letters, anything with words she could decipher by candlelight after the house fell asleep. She learned about abolitionists in the North, about slave revolts in other states, about a world beyond Charleston, where people who looked like her were fighting for freedom. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in March. Whitmore had decided to sell Judith's younger brother to a plantation in Georgia. The boy was only 12, slight and sickly, but old enough to work in the fields. When Judith pleaded for him to stay, Whitmore's response was to have her stripped and whipped in front of the other enslaved people as an example of what happened to those who questioned his authority. That night, as Judith lay face down on her straw mattress, feeling the fire of fresh wounds across her back, she made a decision that would echo through Charleston's history. She would not beg anymore. She would not plead. She would act. The plan formed over the course of a week. Judith knew Whitmore's routines better than he knew them himself. She knew he drank heavily after dinner, that he kept a loaded pistol in his bedside drawer, that he always locked his bedroom door from the inside. She also knew something else, the house's architectural weakness. Built in 1798, the Whitmore mansion had been constructed during a time when fire safety was an afterthought. The servants' staircase that connected the basement to the 3rd floor ran directly past the master bedroom, separated by walls of heart pine that had been drying for 50 years. More importantly, Whitmore had recently had the basement converted into a wine cellar, stocking it with casks of spirits and barrels of turpentine used for maintaining the estate's grounds. But how does a 17-year-old girl, watched constantly and trusted with nothing sharp enough to cut bread, orchestrate the destruction of her oppressor? Fire needs 3 things to survive: fuel, heat, and air. Judith understood this from years of tending the kitchen hearth, from watching how different materials caught flame, from observing how quickly destruction could spread when conditions aligned perfectly. The basement held secrets that Marcus Whitmore had forgotten about years ago. Hidden behind stacked wine casks, Judith discovered something that would seal her master's fate. A forgotten cache of whale oil, stored in ceramic jugs and left to age like the bourbon that sat beside it. Each night after the house settled into sleep, she would slip down the servants' stairs and move one jug at a time, positioning them strategically throughout the basement's support structure. The smell of damp earth and aging wood filled her nostrils as she worked by the light of a single candle, feeling her way along the foundation stones that had witnessed 50 years of human bondage. The texture of rough-hewn timber reminded her of the whipping post in the yard, but tonight, those same wooden beams would serve a different purpose entirely. Judith understood timing better than most people twice her age. She'd spent 3 years watching the rhythms of the Whitmore household, learning when the master drank himself into his deepest sleep, when the other enslaved people were most likely to be in their quarters, when the night watchman made his rounds through the property. March 21st would be perfect the spring equinox, when Charleston's wealthy families traditionally held their seasonal gatherings. The dinner party that night proceeded exactly as Judith had predicted. 12 of Charleston's most prominent slaveholders gathered in the Whitmore dining room, their conversation flowing as freely as the imported wine. They discussed the upcoming planting season, debated the merits of different punishment techniques, and calculated the profit margins on human flesh with the casual tone other men might use to discuss livestock prices. Fire Journal entry, March 20th, 1847. The basement preparation is complete. Tomorrow night, when the house drinks itself to sleep, Charleston will learn what happens when the oppressed stop asking for mercy. What none of the dinner guests realized was that their host had been drinking more heavily than usual for weeks. The stress of managing an increasingly rebellious workforce, combined with mounting debts from his gambling habits, had driven Whitmore to seek solace in bourbon with alarming frequency. By the time the last guest departed at nearly midnight, he could barely navigate the stairs to his bedroom. Judith waited in the kitchen, listening to the house settle into its familiar nighttime sounds. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed once, then twice. At 2:30 a.m., she heard what she'd been waiting for, the deep, rhythmic snoring that indicated Whitmore had passed into alcohol-induced unconsciousness. She moved like smoke through the servants' corridors, carrying a single lit candle and a small tin of kerosene she'd saved from lamp maintenance duties. The basement stairs creaked only once, on the 7th step, a sound she'd memorized weeks ago. In the wine cellar, her carefully placed jugs of whale oil waited like sleeping dragons, ready to awaken at her command. The first flames caught faster than she'd anticipated. The aged wood of the support beams seemed hungry for destruction, accepting the fire like a long-awaited gift. Within minutes, the basement began to fill with smoke that rose through the house's central structure like poison in a bloodstream. But Judith had miscalculated something crucial. The fire's appetite exceeded even her expectations, and the servant staircase that was supposed to be her escape route quickly became a chimney of superheated air. Some acts of vengeance demand that the avenger die with their oppressor. As smoke began seeping under bedroom doors throughout the second floor, Judith made her way through the main house one final time. She unlocked the front door, ensuring that any enslaved people who woke early would have a clear path to safety. She opened windows in the rooms where children slept. She even left the back door ajar, though she knew by now that her own escape was no longer possible. The master bedroom door was locked from the inside, just as she'd known it would be. Through the heavy oak, she could hear Whitmore beginning to stir, his alcohol-clouded mind slowly registering the smell of smoke. Soon he would wake fully, would understand what was happening, would realize that his human property had become his executioner. What thoughts pass through a person's mind when they choose to burn alongside their oppressor rather than live another day in chains? The scream that woke half of Charleston at 3:17 a.m. wasn't the sound of a man dying. It was the sound of a master realizing he'd been outmaneuvered by someone he'd never considered human enough to fear. Marcus Whitmore's voice carried across the Ashley River, a howl of rage and terror that would haunt the dreams of everyone who heard it for decades to come. The acrid smoke that billowed from the Whitmore mansion tasted of whale oil and burning silk, of charred mahogany, and something else, something that made grown men cover their faces and turn away. The texture of ash began settling on neighboring properties like gray snow, carrying with it the smell of a world turned upside down. Church bells throughout Charleston began tolling the fire alarm, their bronze voices cutting through the night air with desperate urgency. By the time the volunteer fire brigade arrived, the mansion's entire eastern wing had collapsed into itself. The whale oil that Judith had positioned so carefully had turned the basement into a furnace that fed flames up through the house's wooden skeleton like blood through arteries. What had taken 50 years to build was consuming itself in less than an hour. But something was wrong with the scene that greeted Charleston's firefighters. The front door stood wide open, as did several windows on the ground floor. Someone had clearly prepared for people to escape, except for one person. The master bedroom door remained locked from the inside, and behind it, Marcus Whitmore's voice had fallen silent. Charleston Mercury, March 2020, 1847. The Whitmore fire presents several irregularities that demand investigation. While most of the enslaved population escaped without injury, the apparent preparation for evacuation suggests premeditation rather than accident. Captain James Rutledge of the Charleston Fire Brigade would later testify that he'd never seen a house burn with such methodical precision. The fire had started in the basement and spread upward along load-bearing supports, ensuring maximum structural damage. The strategic placement of accelerants suggested someone with intimate knowledge of the building's construction and a clear understanding of how flames travel through enclosed spaces. What Rutledge couldn't explain was the discovery they made in the servants' stairwell. Judith's body was found on the 7th step, the same step that creaked curled against the wall as if she'd been trying to shield something from the flames. In her hands, investigators found a small leather journal, its pages partially burned but still readable. The journal contained entries spanning 6 months, written in careful script that revealed not just literacy but sophisticated planning. Judith had documented guard rotations, recorded Whitmore's drinking patterns, and sketched detailed diagrams of the house's structural weaknesses. Most disturbing to Charleston's white population was the evidence of her research into other slave revolts. Denmark Vesey's failed conspiracy of 1822, Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia, and lesser-known acts of resistance throughout the South. 23 people lived in the slave quarters behind the main house. Not one of them claimed to have known about Judith's plan. When questioned by magistrates, they provided identical testimony. They'd been awakened by smoke, found the doors unlocked, and fled to safety. None admitted to seeing Judith after dinner the previous evening. This wall of silence infuriated Charleston's authorities, but it shouldn't have surprised them. The enslaved community had perfected the art of selective blindness over generations, understanding that survival often depended on not seeing what masters preferred to keep hidden. The death of Marcus Whitmore created immediate practical problems for Charleston's elite. His estate included 43 human beings who legally became part of his inheritance, but the fire had destroyed most documentation of ownership. Without clear titles, several families claimed rights to specific individuals, leading to legal battles that would drag through the courts for years. More troubling was the precedent Judith's action established. Within weeks of the fire, 3 other plantation houses reported mysterious blazes, though none achieved the devastating completeness of the Whitmore Inferno. Charleston's city council quickly passed new ordinances requiring enslaved people to be locked in their quarters after sunset. But even they understood the futility of trying to imprison an idea whose time had come. What do you do when your entire economic system depends on people who've just proven they're willing to die to destroy it. The answer would come from an unexpected source, the very community that had just watched one of their own burn alongside her oppressor. The funeral that Charleston's elite demanded never happened. Instead, 43 newly freed people gathered in the pre-dawn darkness of March 24th, carrying Judith's charred remains to a grove of live oaks where no white person had ever set foot. They buried her without a headstone, without a preacher, and without a single word spoken aloud until the last shovel of earth covered her grave. The sound of shovels biting into sandy soil mixed with the distant call of marsh birds awakening to spring morning. The smell of salt air from Charleston Harbor couldn't mask the lingering odor of smoke that clung to their clothes, their hair, their memories. The texture of freedom felt strange on their hands. Some of them had never held anything that truly belonged to them, including their own bodies, until this moment. What Charleston's white population failed to understand was that Judith's death had created something far more dangerous than a martyr. It had created a network. The 43 people who'd lived on the Whitmore plantation didn't simply scatter to other plantations or flee north as authorities expected. Instead, they did something unprecedented. They organized. Sarah Whitmore, Marcus's widow, discovered the first sign of this organization when she attempted to sell the surviving enslaved people to settle her husband's debts. Of the 43 individuals listed in the estate inventory, only 17 could be located. The rest had vanished as completely as if the earth had swallowed them, taking with them intimate knowledge of Charleston's most prominent families. Legal notice: Charleston Courier, April 20, 1847. Reward offered for information leading to the recovery of 26 absconded slaves from the Whitmore estate. These individuals possess detailed knowledge of household operations and may pose security risks to other properties. The reward notices that appeared throughout Charleston revealed something that terrified the city's slaveholding class more than open rebellion: organized intelligence gathering. The missing people hadn't simply run away. They'd taken with them the accumulated knowledge of decades spent in white households. They knew which masters beat their enslaved people most severely, which families were struggling financially, which plantation houses had architectural vulnerabilities similar to the Whitmore mansion. This information began manifesting in subtle but devastating ways. A fire destroyed the smokehouse on the Pemberton plantation, the same smokehouse where enslaved people had been locked as punishment. A mysterious illness struck the dogs at the Randolph estate, the same animals used to hunt runaway enslaved people. The Blackwood family's prize racehorses sickened and died after eating grain that showed no obvious signs of contamination. None of these incidents could be directly connected to the missing Whitmore people, but the pattern was unmistakable. Someone was conducting a campaign of strategic disruption against Charleston's slaveholding elite, using intimate knowledge to strike at each family's most vulnerable points. The breakthrough came when authorities captured Moses, a 34-year-old blacksmith who'd worked on the Whitmore plantation for over a decade. Under interrogation, he revealed the existence of what he called Judith's Network, a loose organization of escaped and still enslaved people who shared information about plantation vulnerabilities and coordinated acts of resistance. But Moses had given them only part of the truth. What he didn't reveal was that the network had grown far beyond the original Whitmore group. Word of Judith's sacrifice had spread through the invisible communication system that connected enslaved communities throughout the Low Country, a network of songs, coded messages, and midnight meetings that white slaveholders had never fully comprehended. Every Sunday, when enslaved people were allowed to gather for religious services, they shared more than prayers. They passed along information about which overseers could be bribed, which routes offered the safest passage north, and which plantation houses might burn as easily as the Whitmore mansion had burned. The city's response was swift and brutal. The Charleston Patrol, originally formed to catch runaway enslaved people, was expanded and given broader powers. A curfew was imposed, requiring all enslaved people to be in their quarters by sundown. Public gatherings of more than 3 enslaved people were banned outside of supervised religious services. But how do you stop an idea that's already taken root in the minds of people who have nothing left to lose? The answer would come through betrayal from within the very community that had birthed Judith's revolution. The betrayal came from someone Judith had trusted with her life. Samuel Reeves had shared the same sleeping quarters, had whispered plans in the darkness before dawn, had even helped position the whale oil jugs in those final nights before the fire. But when Charleston's magistrates offered him freedom and $50 in gold, he chose survival over solidarity. The creak of floorboards in the magistrate's office mixed with the scratch of quill on parchment as Samuel provided names, locations, and detailed descriptions of the network's operations. The smell of ink and sealing wax filled the cramped room where Charleston's future was being written in testimonies that would destroy dozens of lives. The texture of betrayal felt smooth in Samuel's palm 50 Spanish silver coins, more money than he'd ever imagined holding. Samuel's confession revealed the full scope of what authorities had been facing. The network included not just the missing Whitmore people, but enslaved individuals from 12 other plantations across the Charleston district. They communicated through a system of coded spirituals sung during work with seemingly innocent lyrics that contained specific information about patrol schedules, safe houses, and planned acts of sabotage. Magistrate's Record, May 15th, 1847. The defendant Samuel Reeves has provided testimony indicating a conspiracy of unprecedented scope, involving coordinated resistance activities across multiple properties. Immediate action is required to prevent further incidents. The raids began at dawn on May 17th. Charleston's militia, supplemented by volunteer patrols from neighboring plantations, swept through the slave quarters of every property Samuel had identified. They arrested 63 people in a single morning, shackling them in the city jail's basement while magistrates prepared for the largest slave conspiracy trial in South Carolina's history. But the network had anticipated betrayal. Of the key organizers Samuel had named, only half were found during the raids. The others had vanished again, taking with them the most dangerous knowledge of all the locations of weapons, caches, the names of white sympathizers, and detailed plans for a coordinated uprising that would have made Nat Turner's rebellion look like a minor disturbance. The trial that began on June 2nd revealed the true sophistication of Judith's legacy. Prosecutors presented evidence of a multi-layered organization that included forged travel passes, a system for moving people along escape routes, and even a primitive intelligence network that tracked the movements of plantation owners and their families. Most shocking to Charleston's white population was the testimony revealing that several enslaved people could read and write skills they'd hidden for years while gathering information that could be used against their oppressors. The network had maintained written records of which overseers were most brutal, which masters were most vulnerable to various forms of sabotage, and which plantation houses shared the same architectural weaknesses that had doomed the Whitmore mansion. Defense attorneys, appointed reluctantly by the court, argued that their clients had been driven to desperation by the systematic brutality of the slave system. They presented evidence of whippings, sexual assaults, family separations, and other abuses that had pushed people beyond the boundaries of human endurance. The white jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. 27 people were sentenced to hang. 18 received sentences of life imprisonment at hard labor. The remaining 18 were ordered sold to plantations outside South Carolina, their families permanently separated as an additional punishment. The execution date was set for July 4th, Independence Day, in what Charleston's authorities intended as a pointed reminder about who deserved freedom and who deserved to die for seeking it. But even facing death, the network's surviving members maintained their silence about the most important secret of all, where they'd buried Judith's complete journal, the one that contained not just her plans for the Whitmore fire, but detailed instructions for burning down the entire system of slavery from within. Some truths are too dangerous to die with their keepers. The executions proceeded as scheduled, but they failed to achieve their intended effect of terrorizing Charleston's enslaved population into submission. Instead, they created 27 new martyrs, whose names would be whispered in slave quarters throughout the South. The gallows that rose in Charleston's White Point Gardens on July 4th cast shadows that stretched across the harbor like dark fingers reaching toward Africa. 27 nooses swayed in the Atlantic breeze, each one representing a life that had dared to imagine freedom might be worth dying for. The crowd that gathered numbered in the thousands, white families who'd brought picnic lunches to watch justice served, and enslaved people forced to witness what happened to those who forgot their place. The sound of hammers driving nails into fresh pine echoed across the water where slave ships had once unloaded their human cargo. The smell of tar and rope mixed with the salt air, creating an atmosphere thick with the weight of history repeating itself. The texture of fear was palpable in the hands of every enslaved person in the crowd, their fingers unconsciously touching the scars left by whips and brands as they watched their friends prepare to die. What Charleston's authorities hadn't anticipated was how the executions would transform Judith's story from local rebellion into something approaching legend. As each person climbed the gallows steps, they spoke her name aloud, turning a 17-year-old girl into a symbol that would outlive everyone present that day. The first to die was Marcus Thompson, the 42-year-old carpenter who'd helped design the network's communication system. His final words carried across the crowd. Judith showed us that fire burns upward and freedom rises with the smoke. The second was Rebecca Williams, a 19-year-old house servant who'd used her access to plantation records to map the network's targets. She died whispering the names of children who'd been sold away from their families. Charleston Mercury, July 5th, 1847. The executions proceeded without incident, though observers noted the unusual composure displayed by the condemned. Several made statements that authorities deemed inflammatory and have chosen not to reproduce in detail. But the executions created an unintended consequence that would haunt Charleston for generations. In trying to make an example of Judith's followers, the city had given them a platform to spread her message to the largest gathering of enslaved people in South Carolina's history. Every person forced to watch carried those final words back to their plantations, where they would be repeated in whispers for decades to come. The network's surviving members had prepared for this moment. Hidden throughout Charleston were copies of Judith's writings, transcribed by hand and buried in locations known only to a select few. These documents contained more than just plans for rebellion. They included detailed instructions for psychological warfare, methods for gradually weakening the plantation system from within, and most dangerously, philosophical arguments that challenged the very foundations of slavery. Within weeks of the executions, plantation owners throughout the Lowcountry began reporting subtle but persistent problems. Tools disappeared and reappeared damaged. Crops failed in patterns that suggested deliberate sabotage. Horses sickened mysteriously. Wells became contaminated. None of these incidents could be traced to specific individuals, but the cumulative effect was devastating to plantation profitability. The real genius of Judith's system revealed itself in how it adapted to persecution. Rather than relying on centralized leadership that could be captured and executed, the network operated through autonomous cells that could function independently. Each cell knew only its immediate contacts, making it nearly impossible for authorities to trace the full extent of the organization. Samuel Reeves, the betrayer who'd received $50 and his freedom for providing testimony, discovered the true price of his cooperation when he attempted to leave South Carolina. Free black communities throughout the South had been warned about his betrayal through the same communication networks he'd helped destroy. No church would shelter him. No employer would hire him. No community would accept him. He was found dead in a Baltimore alley 3 months after the executions. His throat cut and his betrayal payment scattered around his body like pieces of silver. Pinned to his coat was a note written in the same careful script that had filled Judith's journal. Fire burns traitors too. The message was clear to anyone who understood its meaning. Judith's network had evolved beyond its original members, beyond its original purpose, beyond the control of anyone who thought they could destroy it with executions and intimidation. How do you kill an idea that's already taken root in the minds of people who've discovered they have nothing left to lose? The answer would come from an unexpected source. The very system that had created Judith in the first place. The plantation economy that had seemed unshakable for 2 centuries began eating itself alive in the months following the Charleston executions. Insurance companies, spooked by the pattern of mysterious fires and sabotage, raised premiums on plantation properties by 300%. Banks became reluctant to extend credit against human collateral that might disappear overnight or turn deadly without warning. The sound of auctioneers' hammers fell like funeral drums across Charleston's slave markets as desperate plantation owners liquidated their human property to cover mounting debts. The smell of fierce sweat permeated the auction blocks, where families were torn apart, not by profit anymore, but by panic. The texture of economic collapse felt different from anything the South had experienced, smooth on the surface, but rotting from within like fruit left too long in the sun. By December of 1847, 14 plantation houses had burned under suspicious circumstances across South Carolina. Each fire displayed the same methodical precision that had destroyed the Whitmore mansion. Strategic placement of accelerants, structural knowledge of vulnerable points, and timing that suggested intimate familiarity with the target's routines. What made these fires particularly terrifying for Charleston's elite was their apparent randomness. The Whitmore plantation had been known for its brutal treatment of enslaved people, providing an obvious motive for Judith's revenge. But the subsequent targets included some of the region's more benevolent masters, families who prided themselves on providing better food, cleaner quarters, and fewer whippings than their neighbors. Private correspondence, December 18th, 1847. The attack seemed designed to demonstrate that no amount of kindness can purchase safety from those who reject the entire system of bondage. This suggests a level of political sophistication that challenges our fundamental assumptions about the Negro character. The network had evolved beyond seeking revenge against individual masters. It was now targeting the economic foundations of slavery itself, understanding that destroying the profitability of human bondage would accomplish more than any number of individual acts of rebellion. This strategic shift reflected the influence of Judith's complete writings, which had finally been recovered by authorities in October, hidden beneath the floorboards of a burned church in the Sea Islands. Her journal revealed the true scope of her vision. She hadn't simply planned to kill Marcus Whitmore. She designed a template for dismantling the entire plantation system through coordinated economic warfare. The journal contained detailed analysis of slavery's economic vulnerabilities, the massive capital investments required to purchase enslaved people, the insurance costs that made plantation ownership increasingly risky, the dependency on credit that left most planters perpetually indebted to northern banks. Judith had understood something that escaped most abolitionists: slavery could be destroyed more effectively through financial pressure than through moral arguments. Her followers had implemented this strategy with devastating precision. By making slave ownership unprofitable rather than simply immoral, they turned the plantation system's own logic against itself. Insurance companies began refusing to cover properties with large enslaved populations. Banks started demanding higher interest rates on loans secured by human collateral. Even the slave trade itself became unstable, as buyers worried about purchasing people who might burn down their new homes. The psychological impact proved even more destructive than the economic damage. Charleston's white families found themselves unable to sleep peacefully in houses maintained by people who might be planning their destruction. Every meal prepared by enslaved cooks became suspect. Every fire lit in a fireplace raised questions about who had access to accelerants. The intimate nature of household slavery, once viewed as proof of the system's beneficence, now felt like an invitation to murder. Children of plantation families began experiencing nightmares about their nurses and playmates. Wives refused to be alone with enslaved house servants. Masters found themselves checking locks obsessively, jumping at unexpected sounds, and viewing every act of apparent loyalty as potential deception. The trust that had made the plantation system psychologically sustainable for white families was dissolving like sugar in rain. But the network's greatest victory came through an action they never took. In January of 1848, rumors spread that a coordinated uprising was planned for the anniversary of Judith's fire. The rumor was false, planted deliberately to trigger the white community's response. Charleston's militia was called out. Martial law was declared. Hundreds of enslaved people were rounded up and imprisoned on suspicion alone. The economic disruption caused by these security measures cost the city more than any actual rebellion could have achieved. What happens when the cure becomes more destructive than the disease? The silence that settled over Charleston in the spring of 1848 was not the silence of peace, but the silence of a system holding its breath before collapse. By May, 17 of the city's most prominent plantation families had sold their properties and moved north, abandoning fortunes built over generations rather than face another night wondering if their house servants were planning their deaths. The sound of departure echoed through Charleston's cobblestone streets, wagon wheels grinding against stone, ship horns calling from the harbor, the hollow thump of auction hammers selling off the remnants of a dying world. The smell of change hung in the salt air, mixed with the lingering odor of smoke that seemed to cling to the city like a permanent reminder of what fire could accomplish. The texture of fear had become so familiar that children born that year would grow up thinking anxiety was simply the natural state of being white in South Carolina. The final accounting of Judith's war against slavery revealed numbers that staggered even those who'd lived through it. Property damage exceeded $2 million, equivalent to $40 million in today's currency. Insurance claims bankrupted 3 companies and forced the remaining insurers to stop covering plantation properties entirely. The slave trade in Charleston declined by 60% as buyers sought markets they perceived as safer. But the most devastating casualty was something that couldn't be measured in dollars: the psychological foundation that had made slavery seem natural and permanent to white Southerners. For the first time since colonial settlement, plantation families found themselves questioning whether their way of life could survive the resistance of those it oppressed. Final report. Charleston Committee of Public Safety, June 30th, 1848. The events of the past year have demonstrated that our peculiar institution faces challenges that cannot be resolved through traditional methods of control. The enemy has learned to use our own economic structures against us. The network that began with Judith's sacrifice had accomplished something that decades of abolitionist activism had failed to achieve. It had made slavery unprofitable for the very people who practiced it. The fear of rebellion now cost more than the labor of enslaved people was worth, turning the economic logic of bondage upside down. Charleston's remaining plantation owners tried desperate measures to restore stability. They imported overseers from other states, installed elaborate security systems, even attempted to negotiate directly with what they assumed were the network's leaders. Nothing worked because they fundamentally misunderstood what they were fighting. Judith had never intended to create a traditional rebellion that could be defeated through superior firepower or negotiated settlements. She'd created something far more dangerous, a virus of liberation that spread through the contradictions of slavery itself. Every act of repression generated new resistance. Every security measure created new vulnerabilities. Every attempt to control information only proved how much enslaved people already knew about their oppressors' weaknesses. The end came not with dramatic confrontation, but with quiet exodus. By 1850, Charleston's slave population had declined by 30% through escape, early manumission, and simple abandonment by owners who could no longer afford the risk. The plantations that remained operated with skeleton crews of increasingly militant workers who understood that their masters lived in constant fear. Judith's grave in the grove of live oaks became a pilgrimage site for those seeking inspiration to continue her work. They came in darkness, leaving small offerings, a flower, a stone, sometimes a piece of paper with the name of someone they'd helped escape or a master they'd successfully sabotaged. The location remained secret for over a century, protected by a community that understood the power of symbols to outlive their creators. The woman who'd chosen to burn alongside her oppressor, rather than live another day in chains, had accomplished something unprecedented in American history. She'd proven that slavery could be destroyed not just through moral arguments or political action, but through the systematic application of intelligence, planning, and strategic violence by the people it oppressed. Some fires never truly die. They just wait underground until conditions are right to rise again. They say that even today, when Charleston's evening fog rolls in from the harbor, you can still smell smoke near the spot where the Whitmore mansion once stood, and locals claim that sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, they hear the sound of a young woman humming work songs that were never meant for masters' ears. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.